Mr. Majewski's Anatomy 32 class lecture, Chapter 20, Part 2, Motor Control. So, as we talked before, the somatic sensory receptors send their signal onto the somatic sensory neurons that then take the signal to the central nervous system. And in most cases that we've talked about, the receptor and the somatic sensory neuron have been the same cell. So, the somatic sensory neurons send that information to two main places in our brain. The primary somatosensory area, also known as the postcentral gyrus, and the cerebellum. These are the places where we're detecting the somatic senses. So it turns out this isn't just one neuron carrying it all the way up to the brain. There is a set series of a set series of at least three neurons involved. There's the first order neurons. These are the neurons that go from the somatic receptors to the brain stem or spinal cord, depending on where they're located. And again, this could also be the receptor itself. So that brings it to the central nervous system. From here, you get it synapses with the second order neurons. These are the neurons found in the brainstem or spinal cord that then take the signal all the way up to the thalamus or the cerebellum. And remember, this is also the neuron where it'll experience decussation, so that things on the right side go to the left side of the brain, and etc. And then from here, in the cerebellum or the thalamus, it'll synapse with the third order neurons. And the third order neurons will then send the signal up to the correct portion of the primary somatosensory area. And so the thalamus here is very key in acting as a relay station, making sure the signals go where they need to go. Now, there are different areas in the spinal cord that carry the somatosensory pathways. So you got the posterior column is a big one, as well as the anterior and lateral spinothalamic tracts and the anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts. And as you can guess, the spinocerebellar are sending signals to the cerebellum, while the posterior column and the spinothalamic tracts are sending it to the thalamus. So then you get the sensations detected by the somatosensory portion or the postcentral gyrus. Then through commissural tracts, they will take the signal from the somatosensory gyrus to the associated areas, and then to the precentral gyrus or the primary motor area that has its own map of where it needs to send its motor neurons in order to get the response desired. So the somatic motor pathway involves at least two motor neurons. You have the upper motor neuron that originates in the primary motor area of the brain, and it's going to start taking the signal down into the brainstem or spinal cord, where it will synapse with the lower motor neuron, which is the final span that's going to send the signal to the correct effector, which in this case is almost always a skeletal muscle, so that you then get your muscle contracting and movement occurring. And the motor pathways go through very specific portions of the spinal cord, the lateral caudal spinal tract, the anterior caudal spinal tract, and the cortical bulbar tract. Basically, the key thing here is to remember that very specific portions of the spinal cord are carrying the axons for the neuron's function. So, what about the indirect motor pathway? So that was as direct as you can get. Well, it turns out that in general, we don't use the direct motor pathway. We use a more indirect one, where we have lots of synapses, and neurons are synapsing with different neurons, signals are going in different places. The motor cortex, the thalamus, cerebellum, basal nuclei, etc., 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 because we want to really integrate the information so that we can get more complicated responses. It's not always a jerk away motion. Sometimes we want to do other things, like a layup, for instance. So we've got that upper motor neuron that's originating in the precentral gyrus, or somatic motor area of the brain. And it is going to be able to synapse with various local neurons found in the brain. It's going to be receiving information from the commissural neurons from the sensory side. It's going to be getting information from the basal nuclei neurons that are involved in initiating and terminating movements. And it's going to get information from the cerebellar neurons that are comparing what we want to do with what is actually happening. And from here, the upper motor neuron can then signal to, say, some interneurons, which may connect to other portions of the brain or move on down toward that lower motor neuron. And these interneurons are often found in the thalamus, and they can also be affected by the cerebellar neurons and the basal nuclei neurons, so that you're constantly getting potential information affecting the actual final somatic response. Until finally it connects to the lower motor neuron, which will make contact with the effector, causing the muscle to contract. So the point being here is that while we've been talking about the simplest ways that signals are carried in the brain and spinal cord to reach the effectors, it actually can be extremely complex. So, as mentioned before, the basal nuclei is very important in movements. It both is important in the initiation and termination of movements. It's receiving sensory input from our various senses, including vision, hearing, equilibrium, and so forth. And it's also getting information from associated and motor areas. And then it's sending this processed information out through the thalamus or to the motor cortex in order to cause an influence in what we're doing. The basal nuclei also is involved in suppressing unwanted movements. There are things that could be done that we don't want done. It's also involved in the control of muscle tone, which is something that is in skeletal muscles but is not something we normally think about. And it also can influence the cortical function itself, again through initiation and termination of cognitive functions such as memory, attention, planning, and the regulation of emotional behavior. So the basal nuclei, composed of the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus, are very important for pretty much what we think of as what the brain does. Then there's the cerebellum, which again is also involved heavily in how we conduct motions. So it monitors the intention for movement. So it's saying, hey, we want to grab that glass. Are we actually moving in a way so that we can grab that glass? So that would be also number 2, monitoring the actual movements. It wants to be able to compare what we want to do with what we're doing through various sensations, the proprioceptors from eyes, from equilibrium. It also wants to compare the command signals with the sensory information. Are we actually wanting to do stuff that makes sense based on the sensory information? Are we actually moving away from the truck that's heading toward us rather than toward the truck? And then finally, it's going to send out corrective feedback. It's going to say, usually via the thalamus, that, hey, you know, that's not what we want to do. Stop doing that and do the correct thing. So the cerebellum, very important. So the cerebellum and the basal nuclei are 2 very important areas for integrating and processing the information to get the proper response. They're not the only places, but they're 2 very critical ones. So now we're going to talk about the simplest direct somatic pathway. So this is the simplest one. First, we have the receptor, which can be a separate thing, or it is also the first order neuron that is receiving the signal and bringing it to the central nervous system. The first order neuron will then synapse with the second order neuron, which then brings the information into the brain, to the thalamus or the cerebellum. Then you have the third order neuron that's going to take the final sensory information to the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. Then you're going to have a commissural tract neuron at the very least, taking the information from the primary somatosensory area to the primary motor area. Again, we're doing the simplest thing here. From here, that is going to synapse with the upper motor neuron, which is going to carry the signal from the brain down the spinal cord until it synapses with the lower motor neuron, which is then going to go out and cause the effector, in this case a skeletal muscle, to contract. So yes, that is the simplest direct somatic pathway arc. Some possible disorders related to these parts of the brain. Well, there's amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. This is progressive muscle weakness and atrophy. And this is caused because the body is actually attacking the motor areas and the lower and upper motor neurons. So when you have less neurons that are able to reach your skeletal muscles, you're going to get a weaker and weaker ability to respond until eventually the person can't move at all and they, well, pass away. Another example is Parkinson's disease. This is the degeneration of dopamine-releasing neurons synapsing in the basal nuclei. So again, the basal nuclei. And this leads to neurotransmitter imbalance because they're not receiving the dopamine-releasing neurons signals anymore. This can lead to uncontrolled shaking, muscle rigidity, slowing of movements, and decreased range of motions. Basically, the key thing happening here is the person is having trouble initiating the movements at the right time and terminating them at the right time, leading to a decrease in the range of their motions. And this is also a degenerative disorder that eventually leads to death. That's it for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it.